I'm Father Dwight Longenecker, and this is the second episode in the YouTube channel Myths, Monsters, and the Mysteries. In this channel, I'm drawing together three of my great interests: myths, storytelling, film, and so forth, and monsters. That is, any creatures who scare us, whether they're real in the physical, scientific realm, or whether they're fantastic or mythological. I'll be looking at a lot of the monsters and what they mean and how they tie in. And the third is the mysteries, which is, as a Catholic priest, I'm involved in sharing the sacraments of the Church, which we call the mysteries, but also the truth of the Catholic faith, which has very often been referred to as the mysteries. And you might say to yourself, well, how do those three tie together? Well, I'm aimed to show how the three of them tie together because I think it's really important in our modern world. Because very often, one of the problems I face as a Catholic priest is that my religion, which is very important to me, seems to be separated out from the things that really interest people. And what really interests people are stories, film, literature, and fantasy games, and all this kind of stuff, but also monsters, the supernatural, the paranormal. That really interests a lot of people too. And the interface between that and science, and that and the so-called real world and religion, is something which I find very intriguing. So in the first episode, I gave a little bit of an overview about myths and monsters and the mysteries and why I think it's important. In this second episode, I want to talk in more depth about myth and how that works on us. And so first of all, I'd like to recap what I said in the first episode, that what I am not referring to about myth, and that is the typical person in the street attitude when they say, well, that's a myth. And maybe they're referring to Bible stories, or maybe they're referring to a political viewpoint which has been debunked. Oh, that's a myth. Or something wild and crazy like there's crocodiles living in the sewers of New York. You'd say, well, that's an urban myth. That's just... And so use myth as a way of dismissing something which is untrue, which is scientifically untrue, historically untrue, or we dismiss it as a silly story that somebody has made up. Oh, that's just a myth. Okay, this is not the definition of myth that I'm referring to. Instead, I'm using the ancient Greek word mythos, which just means story or plot line. But the myth, therefore, the story that we're talking about, interacts with us in particular ways. It's a particular kind of story. Now, it could be a story that's told from real life, or it could be fantasy or science fiction. It could be a film. However the story is told, the definition I'm using for myth is that it operates on us and we interact with it in particular ways. The best definition I could use, therefore, is to say myth is a story with multiple levels of meaning. Myth is a story with multiple levels of meaning. And I've sort of sketched out 6 different levels of meaning. First of all, there is the level of meaning, which is the literal level, we call it, which is simply what happens in the story. Who are the characters, how do they interact, and what happens in the story. So that's pretty obvious. The second level of meaning is what I call relational. In other words, the characters are in a relationship with other people or other creatures in the story, and those relationships are relationships which actually teach us about our own relationships. And so in a fairy tale, for instance, the child will very often be relating to a stepmother or a stepfather. And what does that say about the real mother and the real father? Might be relating to a wicked queen, or a king, or a wizard, or a witch. They might be relating to a brother or a sister. So the second level of meaning is that the characters are in a relationship with the world around them and with other characters in the story, and how they react and what they do and what they say, and it drives the story forward, but it also teaches and reveals something about us and about the relationships that we're in. And it does so usually at a very deep level. One of the writers that I'm very interested in about this is in this whole topic is a guy called Bruno Beetlheim. He survived the Nazi death camps and came to the U.S., where he was set up as a child psychiatrist, a child psychologist. And he has a bit of a bad reputation because it turns out that he was somewhat abusive to some of the children under his care. So his name has been soiled in that way, but he still has made some very interesting points in his book, The Uses of Enchantment. He says, for instance, in fairy tales, the child encounters dark and menacing characters, and they teach the child how to deal with the negative side of relationships. And that therefore it's a good thing that these negativities are in the story, because the child can therefore relate, and learn to relate in a safe way uh, to the negativities that are in his life. He gives an example, for instance, of the typical character of the wicked stepmother or the wicked queen. The child might be frustrated and angry with mommy, says the psychologist, but he can't be angry with his mother. He's supposed to love his mother, so he can take out his anger and fear towards the fearsome female figure. So relational is the second level of meaning within the stories. There's also a political level. That's the third level. In other words, how does the character relate to the powers that be in the story? It might be a wicked emperor. It might be a foolish king. It might be a wicked queen, like I said. It might be some person of power in the story, which is a political dimension to the story. How does the person relate to people of wealth and power and prosperity in the story? The fourth level is an emotional level, which I'm going to be talking about more in a moment. But the person's emotions, our emotions are engaged as we hear these stories. That's why the stories are so vital and so interesting for us, that they engage not just our head, but our heart. And a whole full range of emotions is involved. The fifth level is a psychological level. And now we're getting into some deep areas of the subconscious, where certain symbols are being used in myth. I would say that one of the characteristics of myth, which separates it from simply an anecdote or a joke or a story about what happened to you yesterday in your life, is that there are symbols operating in the story, and symbols connect us with the unconscious. Of course, this was really studied in depth by the psychologist Jung, C.G. Jung, who was big on the archetypes and the symbols that operate in stories and how they connect with us at a very deep level of our humanity. He connected with the dream life and the life below the surface of our ordinary life, and that therefore the symbols operate at that level to connect us with some very deep aspects of our personality. And they do so in ways which are subliminal. We're not, we can talk about the symbols and identify them if we want to, but the power of them is not when we're talking about them and aware of them. The power of them is when they're operating in a much deeper level in our lives. And these symbols occur both naturally and intentionally with the storyteller. So the symbols interact with our lives in different ways, depending on our particular circumstances and our particular personality. So if you take a symbol like Darth Vader. Darth Vader is a character in Star Wars who's the archetypal sort of villain. He has the deep voice, he has the black cape, he has the mask, he has all the sort of symbols of the dark side of the Force, the dark side of our personalities, the dark side, the evil in the world. And Darth Vader, therefore, functions not only as a character in the story, but as a symbol in the story. The fact that it turns out that he's actually Luke Skywalker's father intensifies the symbolism, because now we're into the relationship level, the symbolical level, the political level, the relational level, all operating at the same time. The sixth level of interest in a myth, and this is what I think really seals the definition of a myth, and that is it has to do with the supernatural, or with the spiritual or the psychic level of reality. Now, this is the level of reality which is the very deepest level of our personalities, and it's the level where we connect with the spiritual realm, the invisible realm, the realm of the paranormal, the realm of the supernatural, the realm of religion as well, where we're connecting with the deepest forces of the invisible world. Now, if you don't believe in the deepest forces of the invisible world, well, you're in the minority, because the vast majority of human beings down through history, in every society, everywhere in the world, have believed in the reality of the spiritual realm. And they believed in the reality of spiritual beings, and they believed in the reality of heaven and hell and the afterlife. And so myth are the stories that we tell which connect us at these different levels of meaning: the literal, the relational, the political, the emotional, the psychological, and at its very deepest element, the spiritual. That's why One of the definitions that I would use for myth, therefore, is that it is a story that has all these different levels of meaning, but most importantly, it has a contact, a connection in some way or other with the supernatural. Now, that supernatural connection is what we see in any fairy tale, science fiction, fantasy literature and films, where there is a character or circumstances which bring the hero into contact with that supernatural realm. Now, it might come through magic, it might come through a wizard or a magician, it might come through a fairy godmother, it might come through a little dwarf or some weird character who introduces the person to the other side, to the dark side. Or to the light side, but certainly to the supernatural in one way or another. And we see this time and time again. These are the stories that really intrigue us and really interest us and really fascinate us, whether they're fairy tales or fantasy literature or film or whatever. These are the stories which really key us in and make us interested and make us want to be involved. Now, the way these stories are told in culture are should be tremendously exciting. They should be told in a way that really engages us and makes us sit on the edge of our seat and gasp with horror and laugh with joy and weep with sadness and to engage our emotions in every way. Most myth, therefore, in our society has been kind of emasculated, and a lot of the stories, especially the ancient Roman and Greek myths, have been, and the fairy tales have been delivered to us in a kind of sanitized way. This began to happen with the fairy tales in the 19th century, where the Brothers Grimm and Hans Christian Andersen and various others began to collect the folk tales that were in their society and to write them down. But in Victorian times, they kind of sanitized them and took out some of the lustful elements, took out some of the magical elements, some of the occult elements, took out some of the monsters, and tamed them all and sanitized them. This work of sanitation was completed, of course, by Walt Disney, in which he makes these fairy tales and these folk tales into cutesy little stories done with cartoons. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. In the original folktale, the dwarves are frightening characters. They're loathsome beings from the underworld, and they're ambiguous. They're not sneezy and dark and sleepy. So Disney sanitizes them all. And the Greek and Roman myths were also sanitized by Miss Edith Hamilton. Maybe you've come across her collection of the Greek and Roman myths. She collected them. She was the headmistress of Bryn Mawr, the private girls' school in Baltimore. And Miss Hamilton she died in 1963, so she was a person of her age. And she also did us the service of bringing a lot of these stories into our consciousness and into our education. So if you've done any courses in literature about Greek and Roman myth, you probably had to read her classic book, Mythology. But Edith Hamilton also kind of prettified the stories and made them acceptable in a kind of spinsterish kind of way. And in fact, the Greek myths and the Roman myths and the folk tales and the fairy tales were initially told with a sense, they were like horror stories, many of them, and it was truly frightening for the listeners. Now, as a priest, the thing which really interests me about this is that I think that the Bible stories were like this too. The stories of the Old Testament, the great sagas of the Jewish people, and also the stories of the New Testament, the stories of the saints, the stories of people who are engaged with the supernatural. This is what the Bible is. It's a collection of stories of people who are engaged with the other side, with angels and demons, and with the gods and goddesses, and with they're hugely dramatic. And what we've actually done in the Christian church, of course, is we've done the same thing that Edith Hamilton did with the Greek and Roman myths, and with which the Hans Christian Andersen and so forth did with the fairy tales and the folk tales. We've kind of made them safe and respectable. We've made them sort of cute little fables, pretty fables to which we attach little meanings at the end and give them preaching points. We've robbed them of their vitality and their gutsiness and their fear and their danger and their excitement. I'll be talking about this more in the next episode and talking about how stories really relate to us and how they motivate us and how they can really also open up our experience in our lives to things which are just as exciting as the dark and loathsome and exciting and also light-filled experiences and characters that we find in all these stories and all these myths. So I hope you'll come back and visit again when we go into episode 3, talking further about myths and their power that they have in our lives.